Hello and welcome back to our final educational session of the day today, the day 2 of the 2021 HTCIA Canada Cyber Summit. We're excited to have you here and thank you so much for joining. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please place your comments in the chat and your questions in the Ask a Question box. We are going to be utilizing polling during this session. The first poll is live now. So if you look to the bottom of your Crowdcast window, directly next to the Ask a Question box, you should see a poll box. You can click on that and respond to our first question, which is, are you familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, so that we can get some basic info about who's joining us here today. There are going to be 3 additional polls, so keep an eye on that when those go live during the session. And with that, I will hand it over to Gilles to introduce our speaker and our topic. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Libby. So our last presentation today is titled Attacking Back, Challenges and Opportunities Using MITRE ATT&CK for Threat Detection. So Hoke is VP of Cybersecurity at Nuix, specializing in endpoint security. Hoke has over 20 years of experience working with commercial and government organizations on a wide variety of complex challenges, including endpoint security, insider threat, identity correlation, and quantitative analytics. Hoke, over to you, and you can certainly add to your bio if you wish.
Well, thank you, Gilles, very much. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you, Libby, also for teeing this up. And welcome everybody to the session on MITRE ATT&CK. As Gilles told you, I'm Hoke Smith, VP of Cyber at Nuix. I've been at the company for about 5.5 years and working with our customers on cyber and insider threat related topics and issues. I'm asked to do a fair amount of presentations for Nuix, but I'm really excited to share this one with you guys today because it's, I think, going to give you a very practical exposure to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I noticed from the poll here that where we asked how many of you are familiar with MITRE, that the no's are sort of taking an early lead over yeses. So I will spend a bit of time introducing the framework to you, so you've come to a good place to kind of get initial introduction to it. But if you have some familiarity with it, you will want to stick around to the end of the presentation where I get to specific use cases and using MITRE to detect some of the most advanced tactics and techniques that we have seen in recent cyber attacks with endpoint detection. So with that said, let me get my face off your screen and share my screen and share my presentation with you. And could I just ask if you could confirm that the presentation is visible?
Looks good. We can see it.
All right. Thank you so much. So agenda. So we'll cover just a bit about Nuix, the obligatory marketing slide, which they make us put in. We will then go into an overview of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I'll give you my perspective on why I think this is really important topic, why it's sort of even more important after what we've seen already this year from SolarWinds and Hafnium. And then we'll get into some case examples around detecting specific behaviors that are identified in the framework, including evading defenses, establishing persistence on machines, and collecting data in preparation to exfiltrate it. And thank you for those of you who are putting in the chat, your comments in the chat. Please keep doing that. If there are questions you have, I'd love to hear them. Comments, appreciate those too. So just a bit about us. Nuix is a software company. We've been around since about 2006. We focus really on 3 verticals: e-discovery, digital forensics, and cybersecurity. We're known for investigative capabilities, and what you will see from us in our endpoint security and endpoint technology is sort of an outgrowth of the work that we've been doing for 15 years in digital forensics. We've really tried to make that forensics, take a forensics approach to real-time endpoint detection, and you'll get to see a little bit of that later on. The company is about 450 people, I think. At last numbers I saw, you can see here 2,000 clients around the world. And fun fact is it's headquartered in Sydney, Australia. It's an Australian company, was recently listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. Okay, so the first poll question we asked is, are you familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework? The next one that I was kind of curious to get a sense of is whether or not you know, for those of you who might know this, whether your organization's security team is actually using the MITRE ATT&CK framework right now. Okay, so we've got one no. And then the last question is around, are you using it for real-time threat detection? So sort of taking it up another level and looking at real-time threats. Okay. For the most part, looks like people are not using it. Okay, cool. So this will be a good chance to take a look at this, and I'll sort of make a pitch to you guys for why this is important, and maybe give you some things that you can share with the security team, and give you some food for thought as you think about threats to your organization or to your customers. So just at the sort of highest level, what is this thing? What is MITRE ATT&CK? It's a list of tactics and techniques that have been observed, that hackers or threat actors have been observed using in operations over the last 10 years, probably more than 10 years. These things have all been made public by MITRE, which is a federally funded research and development company. They post all this on a website, and basically give us sort of this gold mine of real world techniques used by threat actors. The focus of MITRE is on post-exploit behavior. So these are things that the attacker does after he or she has established initial access, after they've maybe created custom malware, or they have compromised a website in order to support a drive-by download, or they've somehow introduced malware maybe through an exploit, like we saw with SolarWinds, or actually Hafnium would be a better example, where it was the 4 zero-day exploits against the Exchange server. So MITRE really focuses on the things that happen after that initial entry point. It was introduced publicly in 2015. They had done several years of research before they actually published it. And it's definitely being kept current with the latest technology and the latest threats. So you see the reference there to containers. The current version contains threats that are related or that can be observed in Kubernetes and Docker, which sort of pushes this framework out into cloud containers from traditional operating systems, which I think is really cool. It's been built into Nuix since 2018, so we've actually got some experience with it and got some field experience with it. And some of that is what I'll be sharing with you guys today, is what it's like to use this framework out in the real world. There's a good way to think about it here on the right-hand side of the slide. And this is courtesy of a guy named David Bianco. You can see his website there next to his name. But the basic idea of this is that you've heard probably of threat intelligence. And I like to think of the MITRE ATT&CK framework and the TTPs in MITRE as like a higher level threat intelligence, because the reality that this pyramid is pointing out is that for the attacker, it's relatively easy to change the more basic or obvious indicators of attacks. Things like hash values or IP addresses that are going to be used, or domain names, as part of attacking infrastructure or C2 infrastructure. As you move up the pyramid into things like host artifacts, file names, file paths, or network artifacts like URLs or URIs, it gets a bit more difficult for attackers. But it doesn't really get challenging for them to change their techniques and change what they're doing in order to evade your detection until you get up into the tools and TTPs categories of this pyramid. And that's where MITRE is. It's really about understanding what the end objectives are of adversaries and then beginning to catalog the different approaches that they take to achieve those objectives. And so what this gives us is sort of a much more durable approach to detection than we would see with threat intelligence with IOCs like IP addresses, DNS names, and so on. So don't let this blow up your, blow your head up. All this is showing is the framework behind this threat intelligence. With, on the left-hand side, everything is organized according to these 14 tactics. And these just take, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the kill chain, which explains the stages of a cyber attack. This expands a bit on that into these 14 stages of an attack, and then decomposes each stage into a set of constituent techniques, and then decomposes those techniques into sub-techniques and on down to examples. So if you pull the thread on credential access here, where the bad guy is attempting to get access to usernames and passwords, or other credentials that are used in authentication processes, you can see all of the different sort of broad methods to do that, from at the very bottom, intercepting two-factor, like intercepting the text message that you get from your bank with the one-time code that allows you to log into your bank's website, to dumping out the user's usernames and passwords directly from their computer, because certain processes on that computer contain their usernames and passwords, to doing a man-in-the-middle attack, and I'm sort of working my way up that middle column, and so on. So you see, those are the broad kind of ways to get access to credentials. Then if we take credential dumping and we look at that, and so now we're really just talking about getting credentials out of an individual computer system's operating system. And you can see the different sub-techniques that have been cataloged for doing that. One of which is dumping out a process called LSAS, which contains the credentials of the logged in user, as well as the credentials of other users who have logged into a system over time. And then to pull that thread even further, if we dig down into LSAS memory, the framework will tell us these are the commands that actually get executed in order to dump out LSAS memory so that the attacker can find the usernames and passwords that are stored on that machine. So within this MITRE framework, there are, of course, 14 tactics that break down into 185 techniques, and those actually decompose further into 367 sub-techniques. So hopefully the sense that this gives you is the comprehensiveness of this, right? The coverage both laterally across the kill chain and sort of vertically down into the different tactics that attackers would use to get right down into like very granular level indicators of threat activity. Okay. So what are the use cases for this framework? These are the four that kind of I've observed and heard about over the years. The first one is to hunt for evidence that any of these tactics have occurred recently on the network, or to run analytics to look for these tactics across different data that's been collected. And the question we're trying to answer in that scenario is, has something occurred in my environment recently? So we might, for example, be looking for persistence, be concerned about attackers establishing persistence in our environment, and then break that down into the creation of scheduled tasks in Windows, which tell the operating system to perform certain things at certain times, and see that the Att&cks is a utility that is used to create scheduled tasks from the command line. So we might want to know, how often is that used in my enterprise? Are administrators using that? Is there any legitimate use of it, or is that a very useful indicator of a potential attack? So that's the threat hunting or analytics piece. Red team planning is about constructing as realistic a scenario as possible in advance of a red team exercise and saying, okay, who would be likely to target my organization? And if they were to do so, like, what are the tactics that that group would actually use? And how would they traverse that kill chain? How would they establish persistence? How would they gain initial access? How might they attempt to move laterally? The framework will provide a good way to pose those kinds of questions and drive this adversary emulation plan that says, okay, this is a sort of a credible, realistic scenario by which somebody might try to get access to our network. And so now we have a red team plan that is credible and is likely to surface actual vulnerabilities or actual things that we need to do to improve our posture. That kind of brings us to the next one, which is just about looking at our security posture and wanting to know, like, how well are we equipped to detect advanced threat actors or cyber threats in general? And MITRE will allow you to dig down into things like, well, let me think about my Linux systems and somebody trying to clean up after themselves. So the question sort of here, would I know if logging had been disabled or logs had been tampered with on Linux? And so I can look into T1070.002 and see what are the different ways that that's been observed to occur, and then see if I can detect those things. And then finally, there's what I'm going to focus on today, which is around real-time detection. And this is about, are these post-exploit behaviors or tactics, are they occurring right now? Is there somebody in my network who's doing this now? And this aligns well to this idea that comes out every time there's a major breach, which is the idea of assuming compromise, right? At any given moment, you should sort of assume that there are things going on in your network that shouldn't be happening, and you should be actively looking for those. And this is really kind of supportive of that mindset and as a way to answer the kinds of questions that mindset will drive. So the example here is, again, back to Linux systems and looking for somebody attempting to remove evidence that they've tampered with a system by clearing the command history on the Linux system. And so what we want to do is, in real time, generate an alert when the bash commands on the system are either manually cleared or the entire history file has been deleted. So that's the detection use case, and that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time, is on using MITRE ATT&CK for real-time detection. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm going to assume no news is good news, but if things come up, please do put them in the chat. So what are the challenges? Oh, thank you, Jill. Appreciate that. What are the challenges with real-time detection? And this is, you're getting the Hokesmith perspective here. But one of the things that I see is that this is not an insignificant undertaking. If you were attempting to do real-time detection of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, you pretty much automatically are going to be looking at a number of different tools and technologies and strategies. And if you just, this is an example of what I mean. If you just think about credential access and say, okay, I want to detect credential access, use MITRE for that, then that's going to push you in at least two directions indicated by these techniques. For the OS credential dump, which we talked about a second ago, you're going to want to monitor the command lines that processes are executing on your endpoints to see that there's been a proc dump command or LSAS has been dumped. But if it's a web credential scenario where web credentials are being forged, the guidance from MITRE is to monitor cloud applications for access by the same user in different locations. So like Hoke is logged in from California and logged in from China at the same time, something is wrong. And that's going to drive you to, something more like dumping logs out of your cloud services, your cloud applications, and processing those and analyzing those. And so what that means is that, there's there's a bit of work involved in accomplishing this. And that kind of begs the next question, which is, okay, well, if I'm not going to do like a big bang thing, if there's no switch I can flip to start doing real-time monitoring of MITRE all at once, what are the most important things within the 367 sub-techniques that I need to focus on? And the problem is that they're not prioritized. So you will kind of have to rely either on the tool vendor to say, well, these are the ones that we detect, and so we think those are important, or take another approach, such as using recent attacks to bounce off the framework to say, we saw at least these 24 used in Hafnium and SolarWinds, so we're going to start with making sure that we have those covered, and then expand out from there. And then finally, I think one of the most interesting challenges is that of the 367 sub-techniques, many of them are routinely exhibited in authorized activity, either by administrators or even by Windows or by third-party applications. And the thing is that the way that those behaviors exhibit themselves is generally going to be unique across environments. There's no kind of one size fits all or no single way to adjust all of these detections for every environment. And so it really calls for a very flexible approach if you are attempting to do the sensing, to do the detection across many of the indicators and the techniques and sub-techniques in the framework. Okay, so let's look a bit more at why it's worth your effort to overcome these challenges. And I mentioned that I think that it's sort of more important than ever. And to me, these two most recent major attacks are sort of poster children for the validity and the usefulness of the framework. If you look at what happened with SolarWinds, right, there was a hack into SolarWinds itself, a compromise of their software development process that resulted in a Trojanized update being available. Once that update was downloaded to an individual SolarWinds server in somebody's organization, the Trojanized DLL would do some checks and then reach back to the attacker, who would push down a second stage. And I know in at least some instances that second stage is based on Cobalt Strike payload, which is a common penetration testing framework. And then from the point of this arrival of the second stage, there's what Microsoft refers to and a number of others have referred to as this sort of hands-on keyboard phase of the attack. And this is the post-initial compromise, secondary compromise activity, where the attacker is actually sending commands down to local systems to do things like dump out credentials, establish persistence through scheduled tasks, move laterally, execute commands on other systems, and so on and so forth. And then with Hafnium, you have a similar scenario where we started in that case with 4 zero-day exploits against Exchange Mail, the Exchange Mail service, that once exploited gave the attacker the ability to drop files onto the host of the Exchange service, and then to drop web shells, which included web shells. And then once they had the web shell, they could begin to interact with the box and start the second stage, secondary compromise activity, which again comes back to some of the same hands-on keyboard kinds of indicators that we see with SolarWinds. So in both of these, I think you could argue that if you had done MITRE attack detection effectively, if you had managed to do it effectively, you would have seen not the arrival of the attacker at the SolarWinds and Exchange boxes, but you would have seen the stuff that they did once they got there. And in essence, you would have been able to prevent, it's a little bit like the castle analogy, which is often used in security, right? Where the guy, you're not stopping him from getting over the perimeter wall, but you're catching him before he can get to anything interesting, before he can get to the little map that tells you where everything is inside the castle, or the crown jewels themselves, or the armory, or whatever. You've basically found him before he's able to do any damage. So if you just peel that back a little bit and say, okay, well, like what specifically was observed in these SolarWinds and Hafnium attacks? And I just picked two individual threat intelligence reports, one from Microsoft on January 20th, where they did this sort of deep dive into what happened after the compromised SolarWinds DLL arrived and the second stage stuff began. They identified 16 TTPs from the MITRE ATT&CK framework that had been observed as part of the attack. And then for Hafnium, Valexity's blog from March 2nd, just the one report identified another 6 that were observed after the Exchange compromise and in the wake of the Exchange compromise. And in this next part of the presentation, I'll be going into a bit more detail around how we would do detections of these exact TTPs. So to set that up, I wanted to kind of get you to think about endpoints. There are different ways, of course, to do detection of MITRE ATT&CK techniques and sub-techniques. I mentioned that monitoring your cloud applications certainly plays into some TTPs. But what I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation focused on is endpoint monitoring in particular. And I think endpoint monitoring offers some unique advantages when it comes to monitoring for MITRE ATT&CK TTPs. For one thing, many of them are, and I should go through and count how many of them are observable on the endpoint. I don't know the proportion, but it is a large number that are only observable really on the endpoint. So if you're not doing endpoint monitoring, you're automatically closing yourself. You're automatically unable to monitor for many of the things that are in the framework. But to sort of focus on the positive, the advantage of being on the endpoint, if you are doing something similar to what we've depicted here, is that you can tailor your detections to deal with alerts that you don't want. You can very quickly examine alerts that come in to determine whether or not they are in fact threatening or malicious. And if you find something, you are in position to do something about it. It's not a scenario where you've analyzed firewall logs or maybe a combination of firewall logs and Windows event logs that have been forwarded back into a SIEM, and you've concluded that a malicious instance of PowerShell is running on host X in your enterprise. And now you have to figure out, okay, how do I get access to that? And what do I do about it? With an endpoint agent, you're right there on the endpoint. You can kill the malicious instance of PowerShell. You can delete files that it has dropped. You could isolate that machine from the network, quarantine it. Or you might pivot into a deeper investigation. So instead of saying, okay, I think there's a malicious PowerShell, user needs to shut machine down, pull hard drive, send it back to me so that I can examine the hard drive, process it and examine it. With an endpoint agent, you can say, let me get the directory that PowerShell is running from, and let me get any files that PowerShell has written to that machine and collect those and examine those. And by the way, let me look at the network traffic that between this PowerShell instance and external servers in real time. So you have the ability to go deeper into an investigation if your triage reveals something interesting. So it's really about speed. Now, in order to accomplish that, you have to have something like what's in the middle of this page here, which is an endpoint agent that is creating events in response to things that occur on the system. So whether it's a user saving something or inserting a thumb drive, or it is Windows starting up an application in the background, or making a network connection, some process making a network connection, or a change to the registry indicating that a configuration change in the operating system. All of those things, in the case of the Nuix product, and in fairness in other EDR tools, are being captured and logged as events independently from Windows event logging, and in a way that's optimized for security. But then the really interesting part is what happens next, because in addition to being logged, those events are also passed through a filter engine on the endpoint, which is like a brain. And the brain says, okay, I saw these events occur. Do you want me to take an automated response? And on the picture here, those 9 icons are indicating automated responses that the Nuix agent can take. And those include things like creating an alert, blocking something from starting up, taking a screenshot or scanning memory, and so on and so forth. Where MITRE comes in is in that purple box in the middle, because if you can arm that purple box with intelligence, then you have something like almost like a network defender, like an experienced network defender, sitting on the endpoint and responding in real time to what's happening kind of at the point of compromise, rather than sending everything back to a central server and attempting to process it and analyze it and respond, sometime after the event has occurred. With this approach, you're actually responding as the process starts up or as the network connection occurs. It's in almost real time. Okay, so I've got 4 case examples that I wanted to share with you where we'll go down into the bowels of the MITRE ATT&CK framework and look at a method to detect the TTPs. And really what I'm hoping that you'll take from this is not so much the details of these individual case examples, although I do hope that they're educational, but really what I'm hoping you see is kind of the approach that is possible when you're doing endpoint monitoring in the way that I'm going to describe. So let's start with, and these, by the way, are sort of real world examples. So these are things that I'm encountering with customers who've decided that they're going to take the plunge. They want to do detection as a MITRE detection on the endpoint. They believe in it. And so let's start with defensive evasion here, which is something that an attacker will do, of course, to evade whatever types of security tools are running, logging, anything that this attacker does to attempt to avoid security measures. Interestingly, with SolarWinds, some of the reporting indicated that the attackers, went directly after incident responders. They figured out who the responders were, what their email addresses were, found their email accounts, and were like tracking their email exchange in real time as the security team attempted to respond. So this is definitely a focus area for a number of threat actors. So the sub-technique that we're interested in here is disabling security tools, and the kind of precise example is a modification to Microsoft Defender, what used to be called Windows Defender, by changing keys in the registry. So changing the registry would allow us to disable Microsoft Defender. So the real-time detection that Nuix does is it says, okay, I'm going to alert, and I'm looking at the detection text in the middle of the slide here. I'm going to alert when there is a registry set value operation, and the key name that's operated on contains software policies Microsoft Windows Defender. And the false term you see there is just to tell it that it's doing a case insensitive comparison. So don't be case sensitive when you look for that registry key name. Okay, so that's the initial detection. What did we find in the customer organization? Well, we got some unwanted alerts. I don't call them false positives because this is actually behavior. It's the behavior is being detected. What we're seeing is simply that behavior that we know attackers have exhibited is also being exhibited by administrators or by applications that are accepted or authorized. So in this case with Defender, we have a situation where because the customer organization wasn't using Microsoft as its primary antivirus product, they were, by group policy, continuously disabling Defender. And then separately, they have a remote access agent that administrators use on certain computers, not all. But when it's installed, it adds itself as an exclusion in Defender because it doesn't want Defender to consider it malware. Okay, so what do we do about this? We don't want alerts from these things. These are legitimate authorized behaviors. Actually, I did have a poll question here, which is, and this will ask you to kind of put on your internal threat hunter hat. Is it useful to detect an attempt to disable Windows Defender when it's not being used? And so scenario here is the enterprise is using a different antivirus product than Defender. Should I still bother with trying to detect attempts to disable it? Okay, so a bunch of people are saying yes, which is awesome. Right, exactly, because the attacker tools, the attacker may not know that Defender isn't the antivirus. His or her tools may routinely disable Defender, and that still could be a very useful tripwire to have out there. So I'm certainly in agreement with the majority on the response there. So what do we do about this then? We still want to detect changes to Windows Defender configuration, even though there's a tendency to get unwanted alerts. Well, if you're running, go back to the purple box. If you're able to apply pretty sophisticated logic in that purple box on the endpoint, then you can do something like this. You keep your alert when the registry value changes, but you're going to whitelist a very specific case where the process that's being used to apply the group policy is the one that actually has made the change. So we're going to say, if it's, and I've used a different name here because I don't want to, just to protect the customer, but if it's GP applier that's making this change, then I don't want to see an alert. And then for my administrative agent that's used for remote access, if it is that specific agent that is that's added to the exclusions list for Defender, I'm okay with it. So these are actually two very different means of doing whitelisting within this rule, but they're very important, right? In the first case, it's the process that's doing the change that we want to allow. And then in the second case, it's the change that's made to the registry that we want to allow. So this is where having very customizable logic on your endpoint very much pays off, because you're able to keep your detection of Defender configuration change without being overwhelmed with false positives. Okay, second example is around persistence. So this one comes directly off of SolarWinds, where this exact command was used. And the point here was to actually suppress noise created by the attacker's tools. It's a little bit weird. You would think that they would be modifying the firewall to let themselves in. In fact, what they were doing was modifying the host firewalls to prevent their own tools from generating noise that would be detected by other security products. And in doing so, they tripped over a MITRE ATT&CK TTP. So the detection logic here says firewall rules were added. And what we're looking for is very straightforward. It just says whenever a process starts up and it is called netsh.exe, and it uses any one of these, actually it uses all four of these command line arguments, then create an alert. So what's the challenge here? Well, administrators and some applications will use netsh, netshell commands to modify the firewall. So we could whitelist specific applications, but this also brings up the question of triage and the need to be able to quickly distinguish smoke from fire. And so in the last couple minutes here, I want to show you a video of how this is performed and give you a sense of what this looks like when we are triaging an event in an alert from this behavior in real time. So let me drop out of the presentation. And could somebody just let me know if you can see this?
We can see it.
Excellent, thank you. So this is going to start. We're going to start with an endpoint activity here. So the user and end user is going to execute a change to the Windows firewall using those netshell commands through a batch file. And the batch file is saved to a thumb drive. So the first thing that our user is going to do is copy this batch file onto the desktop. And there's the copy paste, and now execute it. So the command prompt flashed up there as that got executed. Now, this is what the adaptive security console looks like. And what we're looking at here is a view of alerts as they come in, of sort of summary of active alerts up here, just a numeric count, and then a count of endpoints and information about connected endpoints. So what we see here is as soon as that command was executed, that we get an alert saying that this was executed. If successful, this will add new rules to the Windows firewall. So we're going to triage this in adaptive, and we'll use a visualization tool to do an on-the-fly analysis of this event. And what that will show us immediately is the netshell command out there at the right and the circumstances around this netshell command. And one of the most important pieces of information is the command line that was executed. So our first question is, what was actually changed in the firewall? And this tells us right here that on local port 137 for UDP protocol, we want to block outbound traffic. So we know exactly what this change was now. We also know who performed it because the endpoint agent observed the user's name, as well as the process name that started this up. So we might want to get some additional context. We've answered two of our questions. What was the firewall change and who did it? So that's very useful for triage. But we can look back at the process that started up this instance and get even more context. And that's going to show us in the command line this piece of information here, that this was an execution of a batch file at C users veto desktop modify.bat. And so I mentioned earlier that the importance of having tools. At this point, we want to know a bit more about the script. What else does the script do? Does it have maybe comments in it that would tell us whether or not this is a enterprise, something that's used widely in the enterprise, or have something that explains why it's used? Or does it look, are there other indicators that would tell us that this is definitely malicious? And we might proceed, sort of agnostic about whether this is an administrator or whether it is something malicious. So what we've done now is pulled up all of the file system activity from this machine and found that the Explorer process wrote a file called modify.bat to the desktop. And we've kicked off a collection job to actually go out and find that batch file, retrieve it, and bring it back to our server here where we can take a look at it. And I'll fast forward to that. This is the zip file that basically gets created by the endpoint agent. And within that zip file is modify.bat. And so now our operator is able to open that up and see exactly what this is, to see that, it was nothing more than that firewall change. And, depending on the sort of comments that you saw and other information, you can, make a decision to say, okay, I'm going to change the status on this to, investigation in progress. We're going to do some follow-up with the user. And then once that's done, we can close the alert, and that's the end of our triage. So hopefully from that, you got a sense of, what I meant by triage and the importance of really rapid triage. So let me drop back into the presentation. I just want to do a time check, and I've got, it looks like it's 4:45 now. I just want to do a time check, and I've got, it looks like it's 4:45 now. 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 4 Is there interest in me doing one more scenario, or would you guys like me to go ahead and wrap it up? And Jill, I'll sort of put you on the spot to answer if you'd like me to do one more case example or close up. I've got just a few concluding remarks to make. Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, if there are questions, you guys please include them, and I will show you one more example. So this is from More Please. Oh, thank you for the feedback. I do appreciate that. So in this case, we're looking for a persistence mechanism that is interesting to me. This is something where if the Windows registry is modified in the correct way, you can basically cause a Windows process to automatically start up an arbitrary other one. And this is called image file execution option keys. And you can see the two registry keys that this applies to under the detection logic there. What we are interested in is if a value name called debugger gets added to either of those two registry keys. If it does, and we saw this in the case of SolarWinds where they used this tactic, and what they were trying to do in that case was to separate their compromised SolarWinds DLL from the second stage, right? Because they didn't want to burn. They thought that it was likely that the second stage based on Cobalt Strike would be detected, but they didn't want to burn their initial access point with SolarWinds. So what they tried to do was create a debugger value such that a random Windows process would start up their second stage malware. And so in deploying this in a customer environment, what we found was sort of surprising, that administrators were actually using the same technique, in this case to start a utility that they use to help users reset their password. And another way that this was being used is to suppress the end users from seeing the updates are available message that Windows Update puts out. So in those two very different kind of things, what you have is authorized activity living inside the very same tactics that the SolarWinds attackers used. So how do you maintain detection of this without being overwhelmed by false positives? And this detection logic, again, back to the purple box, back to the endpoint brain, says, okay, if it's passworder.exe that has been the value that's added to this registry key, then I'm going to allow that. So ignore that in that situation. And then in the other case, it has to be a combination of both the key name, mustNotification.exe, and the process that is used to actually suppress the Windows Update pop-up window. And again, I'm using different names here to sort of protect the detection. But the combination of those two things, if that occurs, then we want to ignore this type of alert. Let's see, I've got a short video on that, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, again, we'll start with our alerts pane here. To simulate this, I'm going to execute from the command line the change to the Windows registry that's going to add the debugger value, and I'm going to add it to a particular process. This is the set hc.exe process, the sticky keys process. So what that means is that if the user hits the shift key 5 times, it will cause whatever process is identified here to start up. So that's what just happened there. I hit the shift key 5 times, Notepad started, and sticky keys started. That's actually being used by the customer in an authorized way. So if you're receiving an alert on this, you're going to need to do a quick triage of it. You can see, again, the command line here is so helpful because it tells us exactly what's happening. It tells us which process that this is being attached to, and it tells us the process that is being attached, in this case, Notepad. So we can see Notepad's being attached to the set HC process. So the next thing we want to do is to whitelist this. Here's how that's done in the adaptive product. We go into our profile here, and we look for the persistence rules, find our image file execution option language, and then add this string in here and say, okay, if it's this registry value string, then notepad.exe, then I don't want an alert. Now, as soon as in the Nuix product, as soon as that change is made and then it's compiled and it's returned as a valid thing that will compile on the endpoint, then it gets pushed out and deployed out. So now when we go back to the system, and we're going to delete that debugger key that I created previously, execute the same command again, which is going to attach notepad to set HC. So now the question is, do we get an alert? And the answer is no. So that is an example of sort of doing tuning, doing whitelisting on the fly in order to preserve a detection that we think is important. Okay, well, I'm sorry that I don't have time to go through my last example, but I think those three did a good job of trying to get the point across, which is really summed up here, which is that the recent attacks, Hafnium, SolarWinds, I think probably the Excellion breach too, although I haven't had a chance to look at that one in depth yet. But these are a reminder that MITRE ATT&CK is arming you with information, that you could use to detect these. The TTPs that we saw in SolarWinds had been published by MITRE years ago, right? They're all out there. They were available in advance. So this is not like traditional threat intelligence, which says, okay, well, here's some IP addresses that were used, that have been used by Russian attackers in the past. 99% chance they will use different IP addresses, but they use the same attack TTPs. So next point is around endpoint. And if you're on the endpoint, I think you're in a prime position to do the detection, but also to support the follow-up, which includes the triage, sort of on-the-fly analysis, as well as a deeper dive investigation, including evidence collection and so on. The false positives or the noise created by authorized activity is a thing that you will have to deal with from the get-go when you're doing real-time detection with MITRE ATT&CK. But with the right kind of tuning and triage, you can manage the noise. So here we're at 4:53. I really appreciate you guys' attention. That's kind of what I have. I'm going to put up my contact information here, and I'd also like to, I didn't get to introduce him earlier, but my colleague Tim Klinger, who I believe is also on the line, heads up our business with Canada. Either of us would love to talk to you. Please don't hesitate to use our contact information to get in touch. And unless there are any final questions, are there any final questions?
Doesn't look like it. That was a great presentation. Thank you, Hoke, for joining us today. And I think Tim just said hello in the chat here as well.
Awesome. You're very welcome.
Great. So that concludes the presentation. Oh, there actually is, Hoke, if you're still on, there's one question that just came in. How do you keep track of modifications made to the rules? Can you have some sort of source control?
Oh, that's a great question, because over time it does get complex. One of the things that we've added recently is the ability to export rules, so to make them more portable across systems. And so that is one advantage in trying to compare and trying to keep rules in sync. The other thing that happens in the background, and it wasn't shown in the video, but all of those changes are versioned off and saved into a database. So you always are able to revert back to previous versions if you need to, and also to access the individual rules that you're creating across profiles. So like that image file execution options rule that we just created would be accessible to profiles that were being used, for other purposes, because all of the because that source file is saved in the database in the back end and is available as part of a collection of rules.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. We are going to get started with the networking Zoom in about 5 minutes at 5 p.m. Eastern. And that link is available in the agenda. It's a Whiskey Wednesday themed event. So you have a couple minutes to grab your favorite whiskey and meet us over on the Zoom. I'm also going to copy and paste that link into the chat. And we will see you either on the networking Zoom or tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Thanks for joining again today, and we'll talk to you soon.